there's the myth that the poets all were born with the pen in their hand and they have to write, they have to write. I was born in Western North Carolina. I grew up around Asheville, and when I was a child living out in the country, I was more surrounded by Appalachian music than I was poetry, although my grandmother, who graduated from Meredith College in 1919 and came from the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area all the way to Western North Carolina, all the way to the very end in Murphy, where she's taught school in 1916. She loved to write poetry, and she indeed did. So when I was growing up in the country around here, my grandmother lived down the road from me, down the end of Pine Lane, and she inspired me to think poetically. She said, there will be gypsies coming over the mountain to take you away sometime. Join the caravan and go wherever you want. How much more poetic can you get, really? And then my mother quoted Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson when I was a boy, and she said, you are a part of all that you have met, yet all experience is an arch, where through gleams that untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever as you move. So I was around the music, Appalachian fiddle playing, I played the guitar, I was around some language that looked and felt like poetry, but mostly I grew up in the country, around the country folk. And we had a country life, including some chickens with some eggs, and I have a slight memory of a pig, but I don't know if that's true or not. So years later, in my 30s, I went to the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro, Tennessee. And much time had passed, of course, you do the math, and that was in the early 80s. And I saw the storytellers on the stage at the National Poetry Telling Festival, and some of them were telling poems. And I thought, I would love to be a storyteller. How do you do that? How do these people do that? I didn't know. And the people listened and they spoke. And some of them were telling poems. And I came away from that festival thinking, if you memorized a poem or two, you might have a story. And so I ended up memorizing, you may guess it, Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poem that contains the quote my mother offered to me as a young boy. And Ulysses is 72 lines long. I don't recommend it. I encourage you to memorize a shorter piece if you decide to memorize something. But I wanted to do that because I knew it would have significance in my life. And from there, I started to memorize other poems and perform them as theater, and formed a company called Poetry Alive and toured all over the country performing poetry. And somewhere in the midst of all of that touring, I thought, well, if I have memorized all these poems, maybe I can write one. And I started to write. And at the same time, the Poetry Slam came to Asheville. Thank you, Alan Wolfe, Ginger West, Lee Lancaster, and some other people, myself included. And when the Slam came to Asheville in the early 90s, I thought, well, I'm going to get a little more serious about this. So I started to write, and that is how I came to poetry.